This episode of Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Inside the Breakthrough, a new history of science podcast full of did you know stuff.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
Welcome to a classic episode of the show. As always, I'm thrilled to have you here. Glad you could join me. And these classic episodes are where we revisit terrific interviews, really great guests from the early years of this show that you might have missed the first time around. There is a new excitement right now about islet cell transplants. This thinking has been around for a while, but the problem has been that once the cells are transplanted, they're immediately attacked. So the islet cell trials of the late 90s and early 2000s didn't pan out the way that we had hoped. But new science, new technology is showing a ton of promise. And we're going to do some future episodes on what's in the works. There are at least two really big projects moving to clinical trials. I'm thrilled about this because it always seemed like it made so much sense. And this kind of stuff was around right as we were coming into the community, me and Benny and my family, 14 years ago. It was kind of the tail end of when they realized that while it worked well for some, it wasn't going to be the cure type of research for many, many people that it had shown so much promise to be. But it really is important to remember that islet cell transplants worked really, really well for some people. And you're going to hear from one of them today. I spoke to Julie Allred in January of 2016, more than 5 years ago now. She was diagnosed at age 10, and she was told she would never have children and that she would not live to see age 30. She has proved her doctors wrong on both counts. Her daughter was married herself a few years ago. But Julie did have a lot of trouble as she moved into her 30s with unpredictable and debilitating lows. These low blood sugars were so unpredictable and so dangerous that she not only stopped driving, she barely left her house. You'll hear her talk more about that. This was not your typical low that almost everybody who uses insulin has experienced. Then she found out about an islet cell transplant clinical trial. She shares the whole story, and I'll give you more of an update on how she's doing in just a moment. Spoiler alert, she's doing amazing. This episode of Diabetes Connections is supported by Inside the Breakthrough, a new history of science podcast full of did you know stuff. The most recent show is all about unpopular science. One of the stories, it's bonkers. It's about a scientist who discovers the importance of washing your hands. The death rate at his hospital drops once he starts telling people to do this. But then they think he's insane. They discredit his theory and they lock him up and they stop washing their hands. You have to hear it. You can find Inside the Breakthrough wherever you found this podcast. And this podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Julie Allred had 2 islet cell transplants, one in 2011 and one in 2012. She is going to tell the whole story here in just a moment, but I want to give you a quick update on how she is doing now. 10 years later, she says she still uses just a few units of basal insulin a day. She does wear an Omnipod, but she says she uses it just for basal. She very rarely boluses. And she says the only time she goes low is if she, quote, makes a bad decision when bolusing for food because she so rarely does it anymore. This really changed her life. I should also mention that I know Julie because she was our elementary school nurse. That's who I got to send little Benny to when he was in grade school. How lucky was I? Julie Allred, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Stacey. I'm excited to talk with you.
Yeah, I think this is going to be fun. It's always great to, for me, it's always interesting to learn things about people with type 1 diabetes, but it's also fun when I get to talk to a friend. So thanks for agreeing to do this. Tell me your story. You were diagnosed with type 1 when you were just 10 years old, right?
I was 10 years old, and that was in the late 70s. So like I kind of tell people always, that was before we had all the technology, of course, that we have today, before we had man-made insulin, no glucometers. We didn't even have Diet Coke. It was tab or that good old unsweet tea with the saccharin tablet. Those were your choices.
That's amazing to think about. How did you manage diabetes? Before home meters?
There was no home meter, correct. So I used urine that we put in the test tube with some little tablets that fizzed and turned colors. and it was a guessing game. And you only did that if you felt bad. There was no certain schedule to when you tested your urine. And as you're probably aware, urine sugar in your urine shows up about 6 hours after it shows up in your blood. So really, when you tested that urine and found out, you had sugar there, it was well beyond the time that your blood sugar would have been high. And you didn't do anything about it. When you saw it there, it just made you aware. There was that insulin you took in the morning, insulin you took at bedtime, and in the middle of the day, so there was nothing. There was no sliding scale. There was no carb counting, nothing like that. We ate by the exchange diet, which some people may be familiar with, and maybe not these days, but so many carbs, so many fats, so many fruits and vegetables. So all the things that everybody is familiar with now, all the technology, all the things we have to keep ourselves healthier and make things easier were non-existent then.
Now, I've heard you speak, and you've talked about how the doctor said you were not expected to live to 30, that you would never have children. Of course, you do have a great daughter who I've met. But did they really tell you that, or was that something you were just aware of?
They never told me. I found that out at my 30th birthday party because my husband had a birthday party for me. Of course, my family came. My daughter was 3 at that time. So my mom's sitting in the corner crying. We're having a party. I'm like, what's wrong? And that's when I found out, when she told me there, that when you were diagnosed, they shared with us that you were not expected to live to age 30 and that you definitely would not be able to have children. That was just not in the cards for people who were diagnosed. And again, at diagnosis, disposable syringes were the new thing. So just all the technology that has come about and just in the time that I've been living with diabetes is amazing.
I'm just trying to have the perspective that I'm trying to think of your mom. Because
that my mom had. Well, I think about that. And you mentioned I'm a school nurse. There was no school nurses when I was a little girl. But that being said, I didn't check my blood sugar at school. So Mom packed my lunch. I ate that. But other than that, there was not really anything per se to do for me at school. Unless I complained about not feeling well or something, and the teacher would call her. But they're just the things that are available today, the things that we do today to manage things so closely, were just not available back then. So it was not a concern.
I'm just trying to think of her being told you would not live to be 30 and then being at your party. It must have been an incredible moment for her. But as you got older, you began to have some real difficulties living with diabetes. I know you had a lot of episodes of low blood sugar. Tell me about that.
I did. So I did very well, actually. Got a insulin pump in 1990. Of course, glucometer in the early 80s. So I was kind of always trying to stay on the cutting edge with technology and have the newest, latest and greatest thing to help me manage. And I did really well. I still was doing really well as far as how I had managed. Not that I always did absolutely everything I should, the best I should, but I had been fortunate enough to not to experience any of the complications that are a lot of times associated with type 1. Didn't have any problems with my kidneys. I had great eyes still. None of those things that a lot of times people begin to have problems with as they move into 30 plus years with type 1. Right. And I was at 34 years with type 1. The problem that I was experiencing was those unrecognizable low blood sugars. And that started probably in 2007 or 8, somewhere around there. It became more difficult for me to know when I was having a low blood sugar. The symptoms changed, and they became less evident to me. And as time went on, they just eventually just went away. I didn't have any signs or symptoms until I was so low that I couldn't help myself. I would get to the point where I realized that I needed to do something, but at that point, I couldn't do anything for myself. I had to rely on someone else.
I mean, so you weren't traveling, you weren't driving, right?
I was driving, and many times I would even with Meredith, my daughter, who will be 21 next week, at that time she was, in her teens, still not driving yet, but a couple times we'd get to a stop sign or a stoplight and she would put the car in park and take the keys away and call my husband because she knew,
wow.
That it wasn't safe. And I did have a couple episodes where I ran off the road. Fortunately for me and others, never hurt myself or anyone else,
Wow.
but the next discussion at my doctor's appointment was going to be taking my driver's license away because I was unsafe.
It's so scary to hear about.
All that being said, I still had the latest and greatest. I still have the newest pump. I had a Dexcom CGM at that point. I was doing all I knew to do. And, of course, my medical team was doing all they knew to do to help me. It was just that was my complication. I guess you can put it that way. But I just was not able to feel those lows and do anything about them in enough time to help myself.
Is that how you were able to get into
work was not an option either. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was working about 10 hours a week was all I could manage.
Is that how you were able to get into the clinical trial?
Yes, that is how I was able to get into the trial because I laugh and say you had to be a fairly healthy, unhealthy diabetic to qualify for the study that I participated in. That being said, you could not have any kidney issues. All those things that I talked about that I was fortunate not to have experienced, but the low blood sugar, the hypoglycemic unawareness was the key to qualifying for the study I participated in. So they asked me about how many low blood sugars I thought I'd had in the past year at one of my first visits. I had no idea. I was horrible, I'll admit, at writing down my blood sugars. But we went back and looked at the month, at 1 month that had passed, and from that, guesstimated that over a 365-day period, I probably had 300, I think we came up with 386
Wow.
lows. And to low, by definition for them, a low was anything 54 or below.
Oh, my gosh.
Right.
Wow. How did you feel during this time? Was this something that you were used to, or did you feel lousy every day?
No, I felt bad, and I knew I felt bad, but I didn't realize how bad I felt. A lot of it was my normal. I slept a lot, when I was at home. I felt like I never slept well, and I guess I probably didn't. Between 2 and 3 a.m. was probably my worst time. That's when I would have the most severe lows, and of course, everybody else is asleep too, so that makes it even more difficult. But I just always, my constant thought was when I could lay down. If I got up to do something, it was how quick can I get finished with this so I can sit back down, so I can lay back down. Yeah. Because to me, I always thought, 15 minutes of laying back down and I'll feel better. And that was just never the case. I didn't do in probably the year and a half before my transplants. I became pretty isolated. I didn't see that at the time, but I see that now. I just didn't go and do things. I didn't go out of the house a lot. I would find an excuse not to go to a party or, not to go to dinner with somebody because I was always afraid of what was going to happen when I was there. And I, of course, didn't do anything by myself, nothing. I mean, I didn't even go to the grocery store alone. No. Somebody was with me all the time. So that was very frustrating for me. And for my family, of course.
Yeah. Let's talk about the clinical trial. You have been through 2 procedures, right, for transplanted pancreatic islet cells, the cells that produce
Correct.
Insulin, in 2011 and 2012. And I'm going to walk through this, so tell me if I get this right. But this is the operation where basically they put the islet cells into the liver, right? Which
Correct.
then helps. And then they take over the job of making insulin. When you went through this, did you know, was it the kind of trial where, and I forgive me for my ignorance, are there people getting placebo islet cells, or is it everybody gets the real thing because you're going through surgery and you know?
Right, everybody got the real thing. That's correct. Because these are human islets that are donated from organ donors, just like any other organ would be donated. So they use the whole pancreas normally for a pancreas transplant. But a lot of times, even when you have a donated pancreas, it can't be used because in the process of organ donation, of course, things come at a higher level, some things at a higher level than others. The kidneys and pancreas work together in the body, and to isolate both of those organs, of course, the kidneys are more useful. You have two kidneys, those can go to two separate people. All the necessary blood vessels that are needed to do those transplants go to the kidneys first. The pancreas is next on the list. So a lot of times, even though you have a pancreas that may be suitable to use, you don't have all the necessary blood vessels that go with them. So that keeps it from being available for transplant as a whole organ. So what they then do is use that organ and isolate the islet cells from that pancreas and transplant them. And that is how I received the islet cells I received. Yes, no placebos.
I feel a little silly
like
asking.
You're on the waiting list for a heart or a lung or a kidney or whatever. And it has to be matched in the same way. You have to go through all those same steps.
And then do you take
with your organ donor?
Do you then, after the surgery, take immunosuppressant medications?
Yes.
How is that? Because everyone that I've heard, I'm sorry, Julie, everyone that I've heard talking about this, they always say, well, that sounds great, but the drugs you have to take to prevent rejection are so harsh. How is your life since then?
Well, it took a little bit in the beginning to get all those things regulated, and I'll not say it was easy, but it was a lot easier than what I had been going through. So taking those 5 or 6 pills a day seemed like nothing to me compared to the life I had been living, compared to the 2 a.m. low blood sugars, to not being able to work, all those things that had gone on before. I did have a little problem with GI upset in the beginning, but again, it's just getting all those things regulated, for each individual, and that happens with anybody with a transplant. And once that happened, I did not experience any terrible side effects. I still take those medications on 2 times a day on a daily basis. And they're just part of my life now. A lot of people say, oh, you have to take pills now. I do. But all those other things that were issues are not issues anymore. And I guess it depends on how you look at it. And it was a wonderful trade-off for me. I would do it 100 million times over again. All the bad parts, the good parts were just a million times better.
Well, here we are, 5 years.
Even though there were issues, right, here we are almost 5 years later. And would I be here had I not participated in that study? I would say I would not be, unfortunately. And I have a driver's license. I work a full-time job. I volunteer. I am engaged in the life of my child and able to participate and do things that I have always wanted to do, but always felt a little bit hesitant to do, and especially in those 4 to 5 years prior to the transplants, that I just didn't allow myself to do those things.
Let me ask you about...
People say, oh, you have a normal life. No, not really. Not a life like I've ever known.
That's a good point. Tell me about what you do for diabetes, because I remember reading that initially, at least after the surgery, you still wore an insulin pump. Do you still check your blood sugar? What do you do now? Do you consider yourself cured?
You can't say cured, technically. And no, I'm not, because I did wear the insulin pump after the first transplant, because even though those islets were working, I didn't get the equivalent number of islets to what, a normal person would have. So I continued wearing my insulin pump. I went from taking 75 units of insulin a day to 11 units between that first and second transplant. And then after the second transplant, I was insulin-free for 96 days, completely insulin-free. Again, I had a little issue with some of the medications. And, of course, the major side effect to those medications are damage to your kidneys and or pancreas. So they did damage. I had some toxicity to one of the medications, and they believe they damaged the islets a little bit. So I started back on insulin in June after the second transplant in February of 2012, and I've taken a small amount of insulin at bedtime since then.
But that's it. You're not wearing an insulin pump currently.
I'm not wearing an insulin pump. I do not have low blood sugars. I do not have high blood sugars. Wow. And do I eat whatever I want? not whatever I want. I just don't think that's in me. I mean, there's still always that factor in the back of my mind. I'm always thinking about what I'm eating, how many carbs is that, what would that do? What is it going to do now? Because that's part of being in this study is there are not a lot of answers what to expect in the future. That's part of participating in the study is we will let them know what to expect in the future just by following us. And there were 273 participants in this study that I participated in. So we're part of what's going to happen in the future. They're getting all that information from us. So, yes, they still follow me. Yes, I still check my blood sugars and provide them with that data.
Do you mind if I ask, and please don't answer if it's too personal, what is your typical blood sugar?
My last A1C was 6.2.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, right there, again, right on the edge. Technically, if you look at the textbook standards, am I non-diabetic? Maybe not. But am I a million times better than I've ever been? Absolutely.
That's great. Before we leave this part behind, because I definitely want to talk about the school nurse component, tell me about was it the Rose Bowl? Tell me about the Rose Parade. Tell me about the Donate Life Rose Parade, the float that you were in for Donate Life.
Right. So in January of 2014, I was the first Islet recipient to ride on the Donate Life float in the Tournament of Roses Parade. And float riders on that float are all transplant recipients. Then on the float as well are photographs or pictures of donors that are honored on the float. And then there are also people who walk around the float, and those people are living donors. So they've all usually donated kidney. And Donate Life has had a float in the Rose Parade for, I believe, this was the 12th or 13th year. So I was sponsored by Emory Transplant Center to go and represent Emory Transplant and Islet cell recipients on the Donate Life float.
What was that like?
And that was an amazing experience. That was an amazing experience. So, I've always watched the Rose Parade on TV and think how fabulous that is and realize that, that's a big deal. That's a big parade. But I had no idea until I went and participated in the whole event. And we were there for 6 days, a few days leading up to the parade. So I was honored to be able to help decorate the float, place all those, some of those roses on that float. For the Donate Life float, the bottom of the float is always decorated with roses that are dedicated, either in honor of or memory of someone. So they all have a personal tag on them with a handwritten note. And so I was honored to be able to place those roses on the float. And the rule is that you read every note on every rose before you put it on the float. So that was really a special experience for me. David, my husband, got to go with me and help as we decorated. We spent 3 days helping decorate the float. And then, of course, I rode on the float on New Year's Day. But again, a tremendous once-in-a-lifetime experience to meet so many wonderful people from all over the country and other parts of the world as well. Transplant recipients, donor families, and those special living donors.
Wow, that's an incredible experience. It was so exciting to see you part of that. So, Julie, we've known each other for a few years because of the local JDRF chapter. You've done so much work with them. And, I was on the board for a while there, and we've kind of circled around each other. But then a couple of years ago, you became our school nurse. And so I have to put a caveat out there as we begin this conversation. I promise I'm not going to ask you anything specific. I understand the HIPAA laws, and I understand the constraints you may be in because, people may know what school you work at. But I just thought it would be a great opportunity because I talk to a lot of parents who have difficulty dealing with their school. The school nurse or the school principal or teachers don't seem to understand the needs of kids with type 1 diabetes. They may insist that the kid go to the nurse for every single thing, or they may be frightened of the kid. And I was just curious if you could share some advice. I know you and I have such a wonderful relationship, and we never give you any trouble, and our child is an angel, so we don't have to go down that road.
Absolutely.
But
as they all are.
Of course. But it's interesting. Before I should point out, we have 4 kids at our school with type 1 diabetes, all of whom manage very differently. It was really
very differently,
right. Not even in terms of the technology, because there's different pumps. One child has been on MDI until very recently, transitioning from injections. But every parent is so different, and it's been a lovely experience because the school has never said to any of us, "You need to do it this way." What's your advice for parents, though, for working with the schools?
Right. The biggest piece of advice I can give to parents is to meet with your teacher and meet with your school nurse. I guess I'm sort of at an unfair advantage when it comes to managing these children and helping them manage at school and the relationship I can have with them, because I've lived with type 1 diabetes. And that does give me a very different perspective. As you know, and as most of the parents know, the understanding that the general population has of type 1 is sometimes a huge misconception. Yeah. And to help them understand the communication between the parent, the teacher, and the school nurse is the key. They have to be able to understand, and you are the person to help them understand your child. The other part is that every child is different, and I think that's hard sometimes for teachers, especially. A little bit hard for the nurses as well, because there is no black and white with type 1. Every child is different. Every day is different. Sometimes every minute is different. And you just have to be able to go with the flow a lot of times. And so you can't always answer every question for them and give them an example of everything that might happen, in a school day. It's all about communicating, again, with the parent and the teacher, and about that school nurse as a teacher communicating with the child. Like your son, a lot of these children are diagnosed at a very early age, and even sometimes by the time they get to kindergarten, they've been doing this a while. Yeah. They know a lot about type 1. They know a lot about how to manage things themselves. And sometimes that's hard for people to understand, that a kindergartner really can check their own blood sugar. They really do understand how this technology works, but these kids do. So having that relationship with the child, for the school nurse to have that relationship, and the teacher to have that relationship with the child, and keeping the lines of communication open, I think is the most important thing, again, because they all manage differently. Nobody's way is right or wrong. Nobody's is better than another's. It's all based on that particular individual child and what works best for them.
What I love about you.
And if you can continue what you do at home, if you can continue that at school, it just makes it so much easier for everybody, for the parents and for the children. And the teachers, I think, and the nurses see eventually that it makes it easier for them as well.
Oh, yeah. You don't want to change management up. I was just going to say, what makes me laugh and what I love about you, too, is you do know this so well that, my son has gone through times where he's been, oh, my diabetes, or he'll give somebody the puppy dog eyes, like, oh, and you don't give in to any of that. It's great. You're just like, look, I know what you're doing. I know where I've been, go back to class, or, we'll deal with it or whatever. And I think that perspective is so valuable and wonderful. And I really appreciate that. But if a parent is really, I think a lot of this comes from fear, that there may be, as you said, misconceptions. And I see a lot of parents, especially online, who will write things, and they're just on Facebook. They don't really mean it, I think, half the time. Like, I'm going to go to school, I'm going in swinging, or I'm really upset, and I'm going to give them a piece of my mind. Can you speak to that for just a moment, just in terms of, trying to, I always tell people, approach it as a team. Even if you hate these people, they got your kid for 8 hours a day.
Right, they do. And I can say, not as a parent of a child with type 1, but as a type 1 who works with these children that have type 1, and I know, I feel like where they're coming from a little bit better, maybe not better than a parent does, but in a different way than a parent does.
I get it.
That it's hard to trust someone the first time that you send them out of your sight. To know that they're going to be taken care of, like you take care of them at home. Yeah. So, again, approaching it, like you said, as a team. Sit down with everybody. Don't have a separate meeting with the teacher and the nurse. Everybody meet together so that you're all hearing the same thing at one time. You come up with a plan that works for everybody, because a lot of times the nurse is not aware of the schedule in every classroom. And a lot of times everybody in the second grade does things pretty much the same, but a lot of times they don't. So again, it's knowing all the specifics of what goes on, even hour to hour during the day, and how we can best manage that during the day. And then what do we do if there's a problem? Who's responding? Who's going to call who? And it even comes down to sometimes, does the nurse need to call the parent, or does the teacher need to call the parent? And just coming up with the answers to questions like that don't get you bogged down during the day when there's so many other things going on. Meeting as a team. Yeah. Listening what the child has to say, too, is very important, because they're the one living in that environment. They know what they're comfortable with. They know how comfortable they are with the teacher, how comfortable they are with the nurse. How long does it take them to get to the nurse? If they're not in their classroom, if they're in another area of the building, how long does it take to get there? What should we do then? Involve the child, because, again, these kids are smart. Most of them are very independent, and they have a lot of good ideas and information that I think we need to consider and take into consideration when we're making the plan for the school day.
That's great. It's great advice.
A lot of it is, too, I think people are very intimidated by the fact, especially a new teacher maybe who's never dealt with this. Again, sharing with them and showing them. Bring the child before school starts if you can. If they're newly diagnosed, come a day or two before they're going to be there a whole day, and let them see the child checking their own blood sugar, administering their own insulin, using their insulin pump. That they really are independent a lot of times in these. Do they need a second set of eyes? Do they need adult supervision? Yes, they do. But many times that's just what it is, supervision, double checking. These kids know what to do.
Yeah, that's a great point. We've done that with a lot of teachers, and once they realize that they're not going to become a nurse or a doctor while they're teaching, right, that really assuages a lot of fear. So, Julie, what's next for you? Do the trials continue indefinitely? Do you go back for periodic checkups? Are you scheduled for more surgery? If I can be super nosy and ask.
Right now, just yearly checkups. I am considering another transplant. That's kind of out there on the horizon. It may be a little while. And then there are all those things like encapsulated islets that are going on right now. So there will be another adventure for me. Let me just say that. I'm just not sure what it is yet. But in the meantime, I am happy to be working at school, to be sharing my experience with these kids. And people say, oh, you've had such success. Yes, I have. Has it changed my life? Absolutely, it has. Has it changed the life of my family? Yes. But it's also changed the life of other people. I said this goes way beyond me. Hopefully it's changed, eventually will change your life, Stacey, and the lives of all the kids and all these parents that are dealing with this on a daily basis. And whatever they learn from me, whatever successes I have, whatever mistakes that we've experienced, we learn from it all. And so the hope is that down the road, we're all going to have the experience of living those days without type 1 diabetes. That's just what I'm looking forward to.
I love doing this podcast, but it is hard to be a news interviewer when I'm trying not to cry. I tell you, Julie, when you talk about this, I don't know if it'll be this type of transplant or it'll be encapsulation, but I know that the information that comes from people like yourself who sacrificed, I know you say it's good that you did it and it's wonderful, but you sacrificed a lot too to get to this point. I know that information will help people. And thank you so much for doing that.
Absolutely. I would do it 1,000,000 times again.
Julie, thank you for talking to me, for sharing your story, for making me cry. That wasn't fair. I really appreciate you joining me today.
Absolutely. I appreciate you speaking with me and appreciate our friendship and all that you do for the type 1 community. I mean, you are the go-to person in this area, and we love hearing you, and we truly appreciate all the information that you get out to us, sometimes on a minute-to-minute basis. But it's valuable information. And people ask me again why I'm still, involved, because it's part of who I am. I want the best, not only for myself, but for all of you as well. And it takes the whole community to support each other, and we need to continue that support. And we thank you for all you do to provide support to the Type 1 community.
I'm leaving it there because I'm going to start bawling.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
I'm going to link up some stories that were done on Julie in the past and some information on clinical trials and islet cell transplantation. I'll put that all in the show notes at diabetes-connections.com. And the episode homepage, as always, has a transcription. I do have to share one embarrassing story. It's embarrassing for me. I remember hearing Julie speak for the very first time. Benny was not yet in elementary school, and she was not even at that school yet as a school nurse. But I heard her speak at a JDRF event, and I'm embarrassed because I kind of didn't believe her. I was in a moment of time, and I don't know how you reacted when your child was diagnosed or when you had your own diagnosis. I did not want to hear about cure. I was very cynical. I was closing my heart to those things. I just didn't want to hear it. I just wanted to get through the next couple of years of learning how to do this and keeping him healthy. And that was just my reaction. And when she spoke about islet cell transplantation, I was not in the right place to hear the message, as some people might say. And I talked to her afterward. I don't think she even knows this. And I was just kind of politely nodding. And people were saying, you should talk to her for your blog, because I was blogging at that time. And, I was on the local radio. So, you should talk to Julie. What a cool story. And in my head, I'm going, well, I'm not going to do this. This is false hope. This isn't good for anybody. And this isn't going to work. I think I was just in the wrong state of mind. And so I'm glad I spoke to her. I'm glad I learned more about her story. And then, of course, when I started the podcast, she was one of my first guests. Very excited about the future of islet cell transplantation. Sure, what she went through is not a cure, and it didn't work for everybody. But you can hear how much her life changed. Absolutely amazing. I'm thrilled. Think about all the stuff that they learned from it. Just great. Okay, coming up next week, I'm talking to the people from Provention. I say it very clearly. It's not prevention. It's Provention. This is the company behind teplizumab, which I say as clearly as I can. That is the drug that is showing such promise of delaying the onset of type 1 diabetes. It is in front of the FDA right now. We'll be explaining the whole thing with the great folks from Provention. By the way, the gentleman who works there that I'm talking to is not only a pediatric endocrinologist, he is a diabetes camp guy. He's the director of a big diabetes camp. And so he gets it, and he gets emotional just like the rest of us. I really enjoyed talking to him. That's next week. Thank you so much to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Stacey Sims. I'll see you back here next week. Until then, be kind to yourself.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.